in many ways, there was a real duality to my lived experience as a child. So in some ways,
Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome to the show Caroline. Caroline, welcome and thank you for being here.
thank you so much for having me. I'm all the way on the other side of the world, so it's pretty exciting.
Yes, absolutely. It's my honor to have you on. Now, on today's show, we are discussing the healing journey of childhood trauma and what it takes to cultivate the desire to fulfill life beyond the trauma.
Mm.
So, Caroline, to start off, can you share just a little bit about your childhood and what was it like growing up?
I talk about my childhood in two very different ways, because in many ways, there was a real duality to my lived experience as a child. So in some ways, I grew up in what I thought was a really normal household. I think many people, we all think our houses are normal until we spend time with other people's families, and then we realize that some of those things aren't quite, not everyone does everything the same. Um, but I come from a really big family. When I was a lot younger, I had a lot of cousins and a lot of family members around me. And I am one of three children. So, I'm right in the middle. I definitely resonate with the standards of middle children.
Yeah,
I feel like I
yeah.
fit that mold really well. Um, and that is definitely my experience. But in a lot of ways, as I said, I feel like my childhood was pretty normal. Like I went to school, I had activities that I did, I had siblings, I had fights with my siblings, I loved my siblings, I had parents that worked, that sort of thing. And I guess to the outsider looking in, that probably is exactly what they saw. They saw a pretty standard good girl. And I use that specifically because we often tell little girls that, they need to be good and they need to show up in a certain way. Um, the duality of my lived experience, though, is, and I can say this now, having a much better understanding as an adult, of what family and domestic violence looks like, and coercive control looks like. But I definitely grew up in a household that was, the undercurrent was coercive control and family violence. I was terrified of my father. His temper was explosive, but at the same time, many times it would be silent. So though it was pretty scary when he would yell, it was scarier when he wouldn't speak because you were either waiting for an explosion or you were just walking on eggshells. And that in itself as a child is really difficult. And I know that many children experience that, especially children that grew up in the 80s and 90s. Like it was similar to a lot of parenting styles. Children were kind of meant to be seen and not heard. And it resonated with the way that parenting was. So once again, I didn't really know that there was anything wrong with that. That behavior was the foundation of what would go on to be, abuse from my father, like sexual abuse from my father. So that then created a whole new set of trauma, as a child. And as I said, that duality continued. So even when the abuse started, on top of that family violence that I shared, to the outsider looking in, I probably still seemed like a fairly normal child. I was really, I really wanted to be as normal as possible and I wanted to live a normal life. And I showed up in the world, just trying to be as normal as possible and probably in the hope that if I just pretended everything's fine, that maybe actually everything could be fine. So that's a really small snapshot. All those elements are very complex. Family abuse and coercive control is very complex, and we're only just learning in the last few years, I feel, the similarities between coercive control and grooming, which is something I kind of research and talk about a lot, but also the further complexities of child sexual abuse and incest. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
it's a very layered, complex story, which, as I said, if you look back on photos, if you look back on anything of that time, or even friends that I had, they didn't know,
Yeah, and
because
that's pretty common, right?
yeah.
Now you mentioned, there was sort of like this fear of, not knowing when you went home how dad was going to be, whether if
Mm,
he was quiet or if he's going to be yelling and screaming. And I could resonate with that with my own dad.
mm,
And it's almost you never left that fight or flight state. So you're always in the terrifying state and very
mhm.
alert
Yeah,
constantly 24/7, not knowing when you got home from school what was going to transpire that day. If it's going to be a good
yeah.
day, is it going to be a bad day? Is
Mm,
someone, and I don't know if you're in your circumstance, if there was physical abuse, certainly there was in mine,
mhm.
in addition to the verbal abuse.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think that was the other part that I found really confusing, because in my mind, when I would think about family violence, not that I knew all that much about it as a child, but my theory in my brain was like, oh, but my dad never hits, like my parents don't hit me. Like they didn't even smack us as kids. Like it wasn't, they never put their hands on us in that way. Now I know that that sits separate to sexual abuse, and I've spoken about that already. But um, so, and I knew friends that used to get smacked by their parents. So in my brain, I was like, oh, but I don't get smacked. And like the worst that happens is maybe I get yelled at, or someone doesn't speak to me for a day, or they slam doors, or they huff around the house, or whatever. And I thought I was lucky because that was my experience. But yeah, being in the constant trauma response state of either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is where a lot of the good girl behavior comes from. If I just be extra good, if I just tend to him, if I just make myself as small as possible, so no one kind of knows that I'm here, and if I'm just good, if I'm really, really good, maybe today will be a good day.
Yeah, if you're obedient, right, and you
Mm.
follow along, then, everything will be okay. You'll be safe.
Yeah, yeah.
And did you like become the good girl in all aspects of of your life, like in school?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
become a people
definitely.
pleaser, right?
Very much so. That went on to set the blueprint of what would be my life for, years and years and years to come. Every time a challenging thing would come up in my life, I would double down on that good girl, people pleasing, perfectionism aspect. And I often speak about how I would make myself busy. So if I was busy and I always had a project and I was always doing something, then one, I wouldn't have to feel my feelings and I wouldn't have to deal with the trauma. And two, I could just keep showing people that I was great and everything was fantastic. So just look at this new thing that I did. And so yeah, definitely kind of not necessarily as much at school, because I, went through some really challenging times in my teenage years. I was mindful that I was experiencing sexual abuse, and then was also just like I don't know, all teenagers go through their time. But towards the end, like of school, I definitely threw myself into different subjects and projects. And then coming out of school, I did the same thing, threw myself into different career paths and excelled at those. I'm now a business owner, so I've done that. I've done the show up and keep showing up, because
Yeah,
maybe once again, if you convince everyone that everything's amazing, maybe everything will be amazing.
that's right. Now, going back, like what kind of symptoms did you experience? Did you experience any type of depression, anxiety? Um, what were the inner struggles that you were
Yeah.
fighting inside?
When I was really young, the first sign of the impacts on my mental health was that I had an eating disorder that no one actually picked up on. I actually, funnily enough, worked it out and then worked out that I needed to do something about that. I'm quite tall. I started modeling as a child, teenager, and a combination of being in that industry and the abuse that I was experiencing meant that was the first time I kind of saw that the trauma start coming out. So there was a point where I was very, very, very thin and unhealthily thin. Um, and I've always had a pretty strong mindset, and I've always had a very kind of on off. Like if I make a decision on something, I can switch the switch and that's it. Um, which is really powerful. And I know that's rare at times. So when I really realized that I was getting really sick, I somehow clicked that switch, but looking back, that was definitely the first sign of the impacts on mental health. But yeah, I had moments of depression. I have been suicidal at different points in my life. Um, and I've had full blown burnouts. So I had my first, I guess for context, I didn't share about my lived experience or disclose to pretty much many people until a few years ago. So I'm now in my early 40s. And my mother was aware of the abuse. She found out when I was a teenager, and she's still with my father. So they're still married. And there are other family members who found out at the time, like when I first disclosed as a teenager, and then were quite complicit to that. And so it was very clear that I was expected to keep that secret and keep being quiet about that. So I did that. I continued to do that for the majority of my life, for almost 3 decades. So only in the last few years have I been speaking publicly, and I've estranged myself from my parents and a few other bits and pieces in that space. But I guess to go back to your question, there have been really key points where certain things have triggered significant shifts in my mental health. The most significant, I would say, was when my first son was born. So I had my first son in my early 20s, and within a very short period of time. And I don't actually think it was postnatal depression or anything like that. I think it was purely the fact that I was now a parent and I could not get my head around what I had experienced as a child at the hands of my parents and the decisions that they had made and the actions they had. Um, and I broke. I just broke because I had this little baby and was trying I was just looking at him thinking I would never let anything happen to him if it was in my power. And I would I could never see myself being complicit to abuse or abusing him. And that was the first real complete breakdown that I'd ever had that impacted the rest of my life. Most of the other mental health struggles I'd had, I've always class myself as high functioning. I've always had stuff going on, and just made do. The other part that I'll speak about, other than mental health, is physical health. So we know that trauma can play a major role in autoimmune disease. I've had chronic fatigue, and it's something that I have to be really conscious of. I've had other health implications over the years. And when we run the data, like when I go and get all the tests and medical tests and stuff, the thing, like the data doesn't add up. Like it's like I am a very fit and healthy person, so it doesn't make sense that
That you
I
have those
have
symptoms.
these things.
Yeah.
And so the more I understood how trauma lives in our bodies, the more that this has made sense to me.
Wow. Now, I know from my own experiences and speaking with other sexual abuse survivors, there's an impact, like you said, there's a physical impact, right? Where the trauma lives in your body, but that can express itself in so many ways. Um, how, like, once you started having relationships, in your teenage years, you're becoming an adult and, you're starting to have these relationships with the opposite sex. Did you have any difficulty? I know for some individuals, me was the case, just touching, if somebody tapped on my shoulder out,
Mm.
kind of shivered. Um, that's just a response to the trauma that my body was experiencing and was still holding on to. So for you, did it have an impact on your relationships at all?
Yeah, definitely. Interestingly, as a teenager and young adult, I had this mindset that I didn't want to be the prey. So the opposite must mean that I must be the predator. Um, and that is a really dangerous place to be, especially as a young woman. I found myself I went through a stage where I was really hypersexualized. I would put myself in really dangerous situations looking back. And it was almost like I just needed to take control. And if I just took control of the situation and presented myself in this way, then um, maybe I would just have more power. And in some ways, that was true, but in others it was incredibly dangerous. I look back on that time of so many situations with boys and young men that were just not respectful, um, safe, and mentally and physically safe as well, like all aspects of that safety. Um, what I did find though is as I would enter longer term relationships, that's when things would get really complex. So that facade of being hypersexualized, overconfident, just I've got it all together and I am this really confident, powerful being. Once I actually let someone in a little bit more, like past those really false layers, that's when it all went pear-shaped. So that's when those triggers would come up. I didn't want to be touched. I didn't want anyone in my space. And I still struggle with that today. So um, I mentioned my first child, who was from my first marriage, which I ended up getting divorced in my late 20s. And and then I went on to remarry, and I've been married since, and I've got a beautiful husband and another son. And or everyone in my family, be it my children, my two boys, or my husband, all struggle and all have to deal with the consequences of the trauma that I have in my body. So I'm not like I will hug a stranger in like a social setting or like someone I see or whatever else because it's a different type of intimacy. But I barely touch the people that I love the most. They are in my heart and soul in a way that is so vulnerable that makes my body even more uncomfortable with their touch, which is a really disappointing way of my body reacting in this way. There's almost safety in strangers versus safety, or physical safety with the people I actually can trust. And it's really complex. It's something that I'm continuing to work on, because the reality is my children now know that, like, I'm just not a hugger. And like, that's really sad. Like, I wish I could be the mum that is really like physically affectionate with their children and whatever else. But at the same time, like, I have other ways of showing them that I love them, and same with my husband. Like, we work through the challenges of what that looks like, and what intimacy looks like in a healthy relationship when one of us is carrying really deep trauma. So it's a work in progress, but when I look
Absolutely.
at how many times that has shown up in lots of different ways, it's really fascinating.
It is, and especially how your body remembers, right?
Mm. Yeah,
And the process of healing that is not something that it could be overcome overnight. It's a process.
yeah.
I know you mentioned you have two children. And I know from not just experience, but I've noticed sometimes that, and I'm sure you've come across this, trauma can get passed on to our children, especially from the mother.
Hmm.
And have you noticed that your trauma somehow has impacted your children in some way or another?
Uh, I wouldn't say that it's my trauma that has impacted my children, but my first son, who's not a child anymore, he's 19, so he's a young adult. I call him a child because he's a giant
Yeah,
child.
they'll always be our children.
um, he, as I said, is from my first marriage, which was a very difficult relationship. And he is still he's still experiencing the complexities of his relationship with his father and what that all looks like, and what it looks like to be in a separated family in that sense. And as he's gotten older, especially because now he's a man in the world that I want him to be a safe man. I want him to not do harm. I want him to be the beginning of breaking those cycles and making change, and not continuing behavior. Um, we're now in a position where I talk to him really openly about my lived experience of being in a relationship with his father. And that in itself is traumatic. We talk in a lot of detail about that experience, and he's also seen it for what it is now. I was really mindful when he was younger, to be really neutral regarding anything to do with his father, because it's complex and children already have a lot on their plate. But now that he is looking at it from the perspective of also being a young adult, um, it's very hard, and that's why I say I don't think my childhood trauma has played a part in that, other than what I shared before regarding intimacy, regarding that element of how we interact as mother and son. So that is definitely something that we work on together, and I support him through as he navigates what it looks like to try to change and break cycles. On the flip side of that, my youngest son, who's nearly 12, has a very different lived experience. One, obviously, he doesn't come from a separated family. That in itself creates a level of structure, because like in the opposite way of that duality that I experience, how he shows up in the world is how he shows up in our house. And he's like, there's no change. He doesn't have to put on any masks. He doesn't have to pretend that everything's fine, because most days everything's pretty much fine. Um, what that has meant, especially because I've been talking about my lived experience for about 4 years now, sharing on platforms like this. I've self-published my memoir. I've done a few things. What that has meant for him and our relationship, and the way he sees trauma is very, very different. So as an example, here in Australia, at the end of April, we had national rallies around the country to protest men's violence, as the death rates of women who have been killed by men's violence this year is astronomical compared to previous years. It just keeps rising. And we rallied recently, and he came to that rally that I helped. I was one of the volunteers helping organize it, and he sat in that space and listened to family members of women who have been killed by partners or ex-partners. He sat in and held space for the trauma that was being shared. And we talk really, really openly about these topics in our household in a really different way to what his brother would have experienced at this age. So it's a vast difference. It also shows the difference between who I was as a mother years
Of
ago and who
course,
I am today. We,
you're a
we
different
all evolve
parent.
and change.
Yeah,
Yeah. So uh, once again, I don't think there's a direct transfer from a trauma perspective, definitely an impact in regards to intimacy and that sort of stuff. But in regards to how I speak about these topics, and the importance of not only him being a safe boy and man in the world, but also having the courage to call out behavior, to to really say to his friends or pick up on behaviors and go, hey, that's not okay, or we don't treat people like that, or what do you mean by that, or questioning things. And because hopefully those micro moments start to shift behaviors in others.
absolutely. That's wonderful. Um, with my daughter, what I experience is she's overprotective. You
Mm.
know, she'll come and if my husband tries to give me a hug, she'll get in the middle. Like, you're not allowed to touch my mom for no
How
apparent
old is
reason.
she?
She's a 15.
Yeah.
Um, but she's always been that way. It's just interesting to find out how, because when she was born, I was obviously just like you with your firstborn, I wasn't healed from my trauma. So how
Mm.
that got transferred over, communicated over to her is now she comes in as being overprotective
Yeah.
of me to make sure um, that I'm not being hurt.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
just interesting to just see and learn how children interpret that trauma that we're carrying inside, and they may interpret it in so many different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And it's very interesting to see that. Now, what was the breaking point for you where you said, okay, I need to start, doing something about these experiences I have? They're taking over my life. What was that breaking point in your life?
I think eventually we just break, right?
Yeah,
It comes up in different ways. As I said, when I had my first son, I had a break, but it was a breakdown. And I guess that's why we have words like breakdown and breakthrough, right?
yeah,
That they're a different experience. I was really conscious that if I continued the way that I was going to have another breakdown. And I shared that at the time, with family members and other people. I pretty much just said, if I don't do something soon, I'm going to have a full meltdown. And what's going to be worse is I now have two children and a marriage and a business and all these things. And everyone's going to be like, oh, Caroline was doing so well. What happened? Like, why did she have this full meltdown? Like, what's going on? So I was really conscious that I needed to make a change. That kind of foundational cracks were starting to show very early on. I could feel them rumbling on the inside, and I had just ignored them for years. I was like, no, 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 I can do another Christmas dinner. I can just pretend everything's fine again and again and again. Um, and then one day I just couldn't, and I had also been avoiding those situations. So though for years and years, I would go to Christmas dinners and I'd do the thing. In the years leading up to when I made those changes, we had just avoided being around my family. So we would go away at Christmas time. So then the excuse was, oh, we've got holidays. Sorry, we can't be there. Or like there was just always a way of sidestepping. But even then, you can't do that. Well, you can do that forever, but it's a pretty exhausting act. And so I chose that. What was funny is I made the decision at the end of 2019. I spoke to family members to let them know that I needed to speak to one specific family member first, and then I would be speaking more openly. I didn't really say publicly because I didn't know what it was going to look like. I didn't realize we were around the corner from a pandemic, so that didn't help. I started this journey around kind of late January, February of 2020, and by March, Australia and where I was living at the time in Australia had the longest and harshest as such lockdown, I think, in the world. Where I was living, we spent over 230 days in our homes. In with like a 5 kilometer radius restriction and really significant time, which you add that trauma on top of other trauma, it was a lot. But yeah, I was mindful that if I didn't acknowledge that there was another breakdown coming, that I couldn't even attempt a breakthrough. And so I spent a lot of time speaking to a lot of people. In 2021, I decided to start writing my memoir, which I didn't even know was going to be a memoir. I just started writing. I did write, I worked with someone to write, but I didn't know if I was going to self-publish. And even now, some days I'm like, why do I do this? I know why I do it, but like some days are harder than others. Um, we're in a really interesting space in Australia at the moment, as I said, with things like rallies and demanding for change. And I sit in a lot of those spaces, and it's a pretty heavy space to be in, especially considering 5-6 years ago I was just pretending my life was normal. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, was your healing process kind of just coming out, finally voicing the hurt that you had inside and writing it? It's so powerful to write down our feelings and what we're experiencing. It's almost like a release process that we go
Hmm.
through, of putting our pain on paper. So, how was that healing process for you when you started writing and finally talking out loud about this?
There was definitely an element that was freeing from the perspective of when you're carrying a secret for so long, and especially a secret when the people that you're speaking to that you love that are right next to you, they don't know. So that from that perspective, it was really freeing. It was terrifying. I had spent 3 decades pretending to be a particular person. So unraveling that in real time in front of people was incredibly vulnerable. And there were definitely days where I didn't know what was going to come next. Um, the way that I describe it is that it was like I had been given a script from the moment the abuse had started, and that was my script, and that was what I read off every day, and that was the character I played and the role I played in our family and my life and whatever else. And then one day I decided I'm not reading from the script anymore. I'm not playing this game. It's done. I'm done. But I didn't know how to live life not reading a script. Like when you do that and it is
Yeah.
entwined in who you are. Um, so writing about that, writing about those feelings, writing about the fear, the vulnerability, um, the lack of trust, helped. And as I said, when I started writing, I didn't really know if I was going to form part of a book or whatever. Um, I also had a lot of other mental health support, so I can't, like, writing wasn't the only thing. I worked with a psychologist who I specifically focused on EMDR, because of those triggers we were talking about before, those, especially the physical triggers. I was done with feeling so jumpy, and I'm not saying that I don't still have those moments, but I really wanted to not be so flighty in my body anymore. So EMDR definitely helped that. I also worked with a life coach, who I had started working with at the end of 2019. So she was with me for that entire journey, and we worked together for a really long time. So her and I were working together while I was writing my book and a few other things. Um, but I think the other part of it that was really important, and I guess I want to stress that I don't see myself as someone that's like healed or done. I speak about moving with trauma, in a similar way to what we said about trauma being in the body and how we carry it. I don't actually anticipate that there will be a day where I don't carry this with me. And the way that I describe it to people is, actually, I actually only described this to someone the other day, and it landed really well. And I think it's something that I'll be sharing more often. But when I think about trauma and the experience of that, and the experience of those memories and the things that have physically and emotionally and mentally happened to me, I carry those with me every day, and they are part of my lived experience, in the same way that I carry the joy of meeting my son for the first time when he was born, the joy of falling in love with my husband and knowing that he was my person and who I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, the joy of meeting my other son, the joy of us spending time together on holidays, spending time with friends. All of those things created a physical reaction in my body, created a mental and spiritual, or whatever it is that you believe in. They are with me and part of my lived experience. And what I find interesting is when we talk about trauma, or when we expect people that have experienced trauma to be able to rid themselves of it, or just like get over it or recover from it, when I'm like, but would you ask them to get over their love or their joy or their whatever? Like, why are they allowed to, like, why are they allowed to keep one but expected to be able to remove the other? Because they all sit in a visceral part of our bodies. So I think for me, as I continue on that journey of healing, because I still want to feel better and heal from elements of what I experience, so it doesn't impact me, so I can't experience joy and love and all of the beautiful feelings, is I move with it. I move with the trauma, and I continue to seek support in different ways. So I think, in 5 years' time, I might need a completely different type of therapist, or I might do like somatic yoga, or I might do something else that is really powerful for what I need at that point in time.
Absolutely. Healing is a process. It's not an overnight
Mm.
um thing where, or like going to the car wash, right?
Wouldn't
Where you go in, pull out on the other side and everything is washed off. It's not
that be so good?
no, it would be. It is part of who we have become. That has shaped us to the person that we are now. Um, so it is part of our history and the person that we are and our character. It's the other elements that you said are still impacting us on a day to day, right?
Mm,
There may still be that sadness, or we may get depressed, or we may still experience that anxiety, or we may still get triggered very easily with a fight or flight reaction when
mm,
somebody wants to give us that hug, or touch us by the shoulder. Those are the things that we still want to work on, but we cannot erase um, our history or our experiences. They're part of us. Now, you mentioned something, and I'm always curious about the spiritual element, because I feel like we all have something in us that kind of helps us through the journey and the experiences that we have.
mm,
And you did mention that, you had that switch that you could easily turn on and off when you made a decision. Do you feel that was like a spiritual superpower that really helped you throughout your life, or there were there other elements that you experienced, like a knowing that you were going to be okay, or anything like that?
I definitely see those two things as very separate. The switch is because I'm incredibly stubborn. Just being really honest with you. I would love to say that that has like some higher being, and I'll talk to spirituality in a moment, but no, I am incredibly stubborn and very strong-willed. Like stubborn is the way it shows up when there's probably a bit too much of it going on and I need to just sit down for a bit. But no, I don't know where I like maybe it is in the survival, maybe it is in the strength that I've had to have for the majority of my life. But I have always been the kind of person that is incredibly determined, and in sometimes that turns into being incredibly stubborn. But no, if I say I'm going to do something, I will do it. So, and I've tested it many, many times. So as I said, I have managed to get myself out of some difficult situations. Now, I'm not saying that that's always been a flick the switch, but maybe it's I've identified something and I'm like, okay, I need support with this, so I'm going to seek some mental health support, or I'm going to speak to someone about something or whatever else. But even when I think about other things that I've done, so I used to be a smoker when I was in my 20s, and actually a very long time before that. I started smoking way too early. But then one day I just decided I wasn't going to smoke anymore. And I just stopped. Like I smoked the last cigarette I had in whatever packet I had, and then I haven't had a cigarette since. And haven't even thought about it. Like it's just not even on the radar. Similar with alcohol. There was a year where I decided I was curious to see what it would look like to not have any alcohol for a year. And not that I'm a big drinker anyway, but I was just conscious of where it was fitting in my life as a stress relief, as a social lubricant. Um, and I was like, I wonder what it would look like to just not drink for a year. And also what that would look like from a social perspective, like how other people would react to that. And so I did that for a year. I just didn't drink from the 1st of January to right at the end of December.
Wow, that's
And so
amazing.
that flick the switch thing can be really like that. It's just in my
Yeah,
personality. But to speak to the spiritual side, I'm not religious, so I don't practice a particular religion. Um, I came from a household that was religious, but we didn't go to church like every weekend. We went when we went. There were times where we went to church every weekend, and then there were times where we just didn't. Um, but now as an adult, I'm really open to whatever it is that the people around me need and want. I have a few mindful practices around um, how I look after my mental health, how I tune into the inner knowing and intuition that sits as a part of the spirit that I feel. I don't relate that. Sometimes I say the universe, sometimes I say the spirit, whatever. It's not really a thing or I can't pinpoint it. But at the same time, I am incredibly respectful of other people who have their thing, which is so powerful to have. Because it can feel really lonely and you can feel really lost if you don't have something. And I see why religion and spirituality is such a complex part of who we are as human beings, because we all need hope. We all need something greater than us at times. And that in itself is incredibly powerful if you can work out the best way of utilizing that to support you on your healing journey.
absolutely. I'm just amazed that you have that willpower, because a lot of times with experiencing depression or trauma, we usually end up experiencing procrastination, lack of
Mm.
motivation. Um, So for you to have that strength, right? It's kind of
Mm,
like um that I want to say that superpower. And I feel
mm,
like every individual, especially if you've experienced childhood trauma, is we all have that superpowers, and it looks different for everybody.
yeah,
um, we could become really good listeners, or or you just become incredible writers, or incredible actors. You kind of develop a superpower in some way from that experience. So
yeah,
for you to have that, in a click of a switch, that motivation that you need to just get you where you need to go, it's incredible to
yeah.
have
I
that.
will say I do procrastinate. Like you'll find me on the couch very often. But if I decide that tomorrow is not a couch day, then it's not a couch day.
And it's not, you
So
don't linger there like most of us will. All have or having the willpower to continue to eat cake for days.
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
they're all
yeah,
coping
definitely.
mechanisms, right? We're all trying to cope with that inner child that's still hurting.
Mm. And I guess to speak to that, that is exactly what that is. I am really conscious that my flick the switch is a trauma response. I do that because I need to be in control, because I need a sense of control. It is not necessarily like I do see it as superpower, definitely, and it serves so well in so many circumstances. But I'm really conscious as I have unpacked my lived experience that that is based on needing control.
Yes,
Because if I can't control the outside and what's happening around me, I can control how I show up. If that means that
absolutely.
I'm not going to be drinking alcohol today, or if I'm going to say that I'm going to go to the gym, or if I'm going to just tell myself that today I'm not going to speak unkindly to myself or other things like that, they are things I can control, because, there were so many years of my life that I wasn't in control.
That's right.
Mm,
And that's very common. I see that kind of repetitive in so many individuals. And you don't have to necessarily experience sexual abuse. It could be any type of trauma that you end up, that inner child just develops their own coping mechanism, or their idea of, how am I going to take control of the situation? So for you is, I have to be control of my situations, whatever that is. For some, it may be, they may be focused on a certain outcome in their life. They
mm,
have to achieve success in some way. And if they achieve success, then that's the answer of them proving to themselves. Or it could be something totally different. It could just be people pleasing for the rest of their life,
yeah.
and as long as that's their sense of control. So that may look different for everyone, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual abuse trauma. It
Mm,
could be any type of childhood trauma that you experience and have those things.
yeah,
Well,
yeah, definitely.
Caroline, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your incredible story and your journey. Now tell us about, how are you using this now to help others? What's your purpose right now in the world?
I'm doing a lot of different things. So over the years, especially since releasing my memoir, I've been speaking more publicly. So I speak at events. So I'm a public speaker. I do obviously podcasts and other things where I get to share my insights. Um, I'm also a trauma survivor coach. So under the umbrella of being a life coach, I specifically work with trauma survivors, to support them as they find some key elements that form a really important part of that journey. So we talk about boundaries, we talk about values, and we talk about communication, which can be some really incredible pillars to help them kind of shift if they're feeling stuck. I don't work with people that I would class that are in an active state of trauma. So if they're in those breakdowns, not necessarily breakthroughs. So I do have people inquire, and I'll often kind of gauge where they're at and then refer them on to other specialists, because I think that I want to ensure that they're safe, while we do the work that we need to do together. So I work with some incredible clients, and I guess the beauty of technology is I can work with people all around the world. So if there's anyone listening that's looking for a life coach that has an understanding of trauma, that I would love to hear from them. And I do a lot of advocacy work, so specifically around the topic of sexual violence. I speak openly about my experience of being an incest survivor, and lend my lived experience and voice to anyone who needs that contribution. I think one of the things we've been missing for a very long time is lived experience contribution to research and policy making, and looking at it from a grassroots level. So that's what I do. And you know, examples of that is the rallies that I mentioned before. But I've got some exciting stuff that's happening locally in the next few months here in Australia that I'll be setting up to further provide peer support for child sexual abuse survivors. And we might be running some online groups as well. So I guess if anyone has resonated with me and my story, to kind of keep an eye out. There'll be some interesting things coming in the second half of 2024.
Awesome. And where can people reach out to you if they wanted to?
Sure. So my website is definitely the best place to find everything. So it's carolinebrunne.com. And my social media, I'm probably the most active on Instagram, which is Caroline_Brunne. Probably the easiest place to kind of send me a message or connect with me quickly. Yeah, and that's where I provide a lot of my kind of free value-based work. So I write blogs, I share resources, and yeah, just provide support wherever I can. I'm mindful that not everyone can afford a life coach, or that, you know, resources are hard at times from an economy perspective. So wherever I can share to provide support, that's what I try to do.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you again for sharing your story here with us. Now, thank you everyone for watching. Please make sure to subscribe, share, and like so I can bring more stories just like Caroline's to you. So until next time.